I want to talk to you a little about your memories and our memories. And as we live longer, that's becoming more of a reality that we lose our memories. And as we live longer, as a community of religion, of history, we tend to lose our memories as well. Ask yourself what it means to live in an age and a time when there's a certain kind of historical dementia. When we don't remember what was, but we're constantly inventing and relying on what's new and assuming that it's better than what was and disconnected from it. I want you to think a little about memory as the source of ethic, as a source of morality, as the source and transmission of peoplehood, and importantly, as the source of purpose. I want you to think, and when I say you, I mean me as well, about you as an intergenerational self. I often think that when I'm teaching a child, I have this responsibility and privilege of not teaching one generation at a time, that whoever's in front of me at 12 years old or 15 or 8, I am teaching, in theory, them and then their parents, because they go home with these lessons, hopefully, that transmit into behaviors that maybe a parent asks, what is that and why did you do that? And why are you wearing that? And what is this holy day? And at the same time, you're teaching at the same time the next generation, because God willing, you're influencing the Jewishness of what will prevail. I mentioned early this morning, that I was hoping that the parents who have kids in our kids program will stay, and I hope you have. And if not, I hope there's something of value for all of us. I believe there is. In some of the lessons and some of the realities of what it is to live in 2018 in this great place called the United States of America, in this wonderful world, the challenges that we have, and the gifts. About 15 years ago, in Atlanta at Emory University, 2 psychologists started a study, and they were studying families just like ours, and they were studying family dynamics and outcomes. And the wife of one of the psychologists was also a psychologist herself, and she was working with children with learning disabilities, special needs. And she noticed something. She observed that the children who knew the most about their families tended to do better than others who didn't. So just think about that for a second. The ones who knew the most about their families, not just themselves, not just their friends, tended to do better in life in that period of their lives than those who didn't have that connectedness and those memories. The researchers, Marshall Duke and Robyn Fivush, began to study families and family stories, and they developed what some of you know, it's called the Do You Know test. And I want to read just questions that I selected from the Do You Know test. Do you know how your parents met? Do you know where some of your grandparents grew up? Do you know the source of your name, first and last, and middle as well if you have it? Do you know some of the illnesses and injuries that your parents experienced when they were younger? Do you know some things that happened to your mom or dad when they were at school? Do you know the national background of your family, all of it? English, German, Russian, Czech, before American. Do you know some jobs that your parents did when they were young? Do you know some awards that your parents received when they were young? And the list of questions goes on and on. But think about those and ask yourself, score yourselves for a moment. I don't mean a number, but think, how well did you do? And then ask yourself, if you're in an intergenerational family, if you have grandchildren or children, how well you think they're doing in answering just that selection of questions. And you might say, well, why does it really matter? The researchers found that the higher a child scored on that particular test, that is to say, the more do you know questions that they answered yes, the more resilient that child was. Resilience here means ability to deal with change and adversity in life, which, of course, we know is part of life, inevitably. The researchers found that children who knew more of their family's history tended to be more resilient. Now, think about this. They concluded that the Do You Know scale was the single greatest predictor of a child's emotional health and happiness. That's pre-medication. That's pre-devices in their hands. That's pre all the pacifiers that we've developed to give them. Stories, not answers. You see, what they realized was the answers are immaterial. You might say, Rabbi, come on, this is pretty naive at this point. All I need to do then is give my kids a paper, give them the fact sheet on who we are, and they'll do well in the world. But we know that's not reality because they won't read it unless you put it on their phone. So maybe develop an app, and then they may have a better chance of actually taking in the information. But the reality is we know that that's naive as well, because answers don't change who we are, but stories do. Do you remember when we had photo albums? I see them in your home. Some of you still have them. Some collect dust. Some are occasionally open. But what photo albums do, as opposed to the cloud, is they open up envelopes. And every envelope isn't an image. It's a story. Your kid says, Mom, who's that funny-looking guy? You say, that's Dad when he was young. Mom, you were married there? She was at your wedding? Dad, what were you doing on that trip? Grandpa, who was that? How come these pictures are in black and white and have those beveled edges? So it wasn't just that what we were receiving were pictures and opening up pictures that now we do this, but we don't enough. We were developing that intergenerational identity of our kids and ourselves. So my imagination says that most of you of my generation and above have a pretty firm and pretty sturdy intergenerational identity. Part of your parents is part of you, not was, but is. Your grandparents' story is part of your story. Your children's story and grandchildren's story is interconnected and interwoven not only into what you know, but who you are. But what I want to ask you in this age in particular, is what's being lost? When our kids are looking down, all we see is the yarmulkes on their heads. I walk into a room, a gathering of teens, and I tell you, I see if they had bald patches, I could name them and draw on them, because they're all looking down and playing a game called Fortnite. And what I want to say is there may not be anything wrong inherently in the game Fortnite or anything else that pulls us down, but ask yourself what it means in terms of your intergenerational identity. But let me explain more so that you understand the gravity of what I might be adding to your story. The researchers found certain patterns in all family stories. They all seem to follow these three patterns. And the first was an ascendant narrative. I see it here. I see it's the guy who came with a backpack, a pair of jeans from Israel 30 years ago, $60 or $600 in his pocket, and he built an ascendant story, something that grew and grew and grew. And that, I have to say, is probably the most common story that I see in Jewish America, ascendant stories. We came from difficult times and difficult places with very little, and we developed what we had and what we are to be what we are today. But there's a second pattern, which is descendant stories. And descendant stories is a narrative of decline, which I would say is less common to most Jewish families, but certainly is part of our story as well, which is to say, we had so much. And I remember my grandparents, their wealth. I remember their abilities. I remember their stature in society. But then generation by generation, year and war and depression robbed that of them and ultimately robbed that of us, because that's also our story. And then there is what the psychologists say is the healthiest narrative of them all, which I think most of us will relate to. But our kids might not yet understand or appreciate, which is the oscillating narrative. It's the ups and downs. It's the couple who met during the war. He went off in the Navy. He came back. He went to UCLA. He got a degree. They were poor. They lived in a small apartment. And then he built a business, and then he lost the business. And then he struggled and went to 4 different places to go work in the morning. Not each day, every single day. He'd go to 4 different offices, developing 4 different businesses, to close one, to merge with the other, to afford the other. And then again, more losses. And then he raised children with all the challenges of raising children, but not having money, of course, to do what one day he would be able to do when he was retired. He built an oscillating story of ups and downs that so many of us recognize in our own lives. The ups and downs, the trials and tribulations, the gains and the losses, the pitch and toss of life. That, believe it or not, as frustrating as it is, as unnerving as it is the most healthy, according to this study, these researchers, the most healthy story. So what I want to suggest you do now is embrace it in yours. Thank God for it. That it hasn't been all one direction, all ascending, or all descending. Realize right now, if you're in one of the valleys, that that's one of the gifts of this life, because you'll grow from there. And your children will learn from you what it means to rise up. And ultimately, you and they will fall again, because that's part of the beautiful tragedy and joy of being human. To be Jewish is to realize and recognize that our family is an intergenerational family, living an oscillating reality of ups and downs, of all of the vagaries of history and of this moment. To be human, not just Jewish, is to recognize what it means sometimes to stand alone, but hopefully, if we walk into these places, to realize we're together. But what I fear is that we're losing memory. We're living for this generation and the next alone. We're strategic planners and thinkers, thinking always ahead but never looking back. And what I fear is in educating our kids to look down and to do so well in math, science, English, reading, and history, and all that we value so greatly in our society, we're not bringing them to these places on a Monday morning to say this matters as well, maybe even more. Because you're part of a story. Inherent in our Jewish story is stories and memories. What do we say to our kids? We say in the Torah, written in that scroll, it says, my son, my daughter, we were slaves in Egypt. Feed that into who you are, because now you know where you stand today in relation to where we were. Now you know how to behave in this world, how to treat this world, how to walk through this world, how to fall, how to see yourself trapped and small, and then to realize how large you can be. And then with your largesse, your expansion in this world, realize what's demanded of you, because that slavery wasn't just to teach us about the past, it was to influence and change your future and mine, to be generous and uplifting and never oppressive. And earlier you saw 6 of many Holocaust survivors. And theirs is our story. But if we forget them, if that's lost from our children's memories while they look down, if it's lost from our memories while we look forward, we lose the gift and the richness of their suffering, the model of their humanity, the extraordinary gift that we have of conversing and learning from them. What it means to learn from what their struggles were, and to know that whether they intended it or not, they gave us something of strength in ourselves. They taught us resilience. You teach us what it means to be survivors, to climb and to strive and to grow and to put one foot in front of the other, even when life seems to be worthy of despair. And ask your children if they remember that when Grandpa was born, there wasn't an Israel, but now there is. But if it's just a reality of today, it doesn't have the depth and breadth of memory. They don't know that history was once and then disappeared, that Israel was once and then disappeared, and miraculously in our grandparents' or your lifetimes, it reappeared as our Jewish home. That's an extraordinary story. But what matters isn't just visiting Israel tomorrow. It matters to realize the past and to fold it into who we are, because that's what makes resilient people. We don't just grow resilient by our own strength and experience. We have the benefit, if we wish to take it, if we wish to join in it, to realize the strength and resilience we gain by calling ourselves Jewish people. Because we are the most miraculously resilient people that I think this planet has ever seen. That's part of what we are here to teach. Resilience, strength and wonder and innovation and invention and goodness and compassion and generosity and charity that isn't a thought that's voluntary, but a mandate that we should live our lives looking for opportunities to give, looking for opportunities to serve. But then ask yourself if your kids are looking down and missing the story. I remember, it must be 8 years ago, we were in a small community in Cantel, Guatemala. I took a group of teens to volunteer. It was our first of these trips. And we were there at a moment that I think for me is one of the most important moments in my life, because I got to see a changing society in the moment of change. That liminal moment between what was and what mattered and what would be and what might not matter anymore. We arrived in this mountaintop village, and we were these privileged few. We came there with our Patagonia jackets, our fantastic and comfortable boots for the difficulties of walking on their dirt. And I have to say, our kids worked really hard. I remember the first day seeing particularly this group of girls, and we gave them machetes because they had to chop down literally a field of trees. And they were like, oh, this is going to be fun, till they smacked the first dull machete on a tree and realized that all that vibrated was them. But what I remember about the trip that's significant in relation to memory and living an intergenerational life is that I asked them what was happening, because what I saw was changing was electricity was arriving in the town. So certain houses had lighting at night while others didn't. And we think, well, that's fantastic, they should. But what I want us to realize is what's lost when we gain. So what they were losing was something that's so significant. They were losing stories. And how? Because I asked our host, what happens in the evening when you don't have light in your homes? Because if you don't have electricity, you're sitting in darkness or candlelight or gaslight. And he said, of course, they didn't have television. He said, we sit and the abuelas and abuelos tell us their stories. They're the storytellers, the grandparents of indiscriminate age, just old people who have extraordinary stories, myths to tell about who they are and who they were and who these children are sitting on concrete floors listening to them. And I realized then that as soon as television and PlayStation and Fortnite and smartphones would arrive in that town, which they clearly have, all of that would be lost. Because who wants to listen to your grandmother when you have this? But ask yourself what's lost. It's not just about that generation between two people, a grandmother and her child and grandchild. It's about what happens within us when we take in the stories that become our stories. This won't give you an intergenerational reality. This won't give you an intergenerational identity. This won't enrich you to give you resilience. It might teach you what other resilient people look like if you happen to read their story posted and reposted on Facebook. But that doesn't enter into who you are, and it doesn't give you the strength to go through the challenges that will be yours in your life. So what I want to suggest and ask is that when we go home from this holy day, we think a little more and a little more deeply and a little more importantly, give greater importance to some of the choices that we have by default made because they were easy. Put a basket out. That'll challenge your whole family. And say, put those devices in because we have to talk. In the car, instead of putting headphones on and headphones in, instead of putting those screens up that fold down so beautifully, because Chrysler and all of those fantastic companies assumed we wouldn't want to converse while driving. They knew a fact that we as parents would value peace and quiet more than conversation. We may not like it, but that's what they realized. They realized that what we would want more than anything else is for our kids not to be screeching or screaming or whining or moaning in the back seat. But what they didn't care about is what we should care about, which is what was lost when our kids stopped conversing with us. What was lost when we stopped listening to them? What was lost when walking became driving and driving became shared silence? What was lost in your family? In mine? What was lost in our stories? I remember one night driving down toward my house. All my life, I've been waiting to see a mountain lion. My wife knows, and it's not a good thing. She knows everything, and that's not a good thing either. But my wife knows that I'm not such a good driver. I'm a pretty good driver, by the way. I can't see her, so I'm not watching her expression. But her problem with me is I'm always looking for animals. I'm always looking at trees. And I'm always looking at mountains. And I'm always saying, look. And she says, no, you look at the road, which she says in a very calm, sweet voice. With an English accent, it's fine. But one night I'm driving down toward where we live. My daughter, whom I adore, is sitting next to me looking down at her phone because she was probably in a conversation with somebody, which mattered at that moment. A mountain lion was on the road in front of us. I'm telling you, it took up more than the lane of the road. I couldn't breathe watching this in front of my car. And it leapt up, and it literally cleared the road. And in one jump, it leapt up and climbed onto the ridge on the side, and my daughter missed the whole thing. I said, Hannah! And she said, what? I said, and she said, but I do the same. People walk into poles because they're missing the journey. And we have a choice. We can continue that way and realize that what we need, all we need is somebody to say, wait, stop, walk that direction because there's a light pole in front of you, but that's not really what this is about. What we want to say to one another and to our kids is there's a story, and we want you to be part of the story. We want you, when you open a photo album, or ask us about something on a shelf, or ask us as you drive by a house and say, Dad, didn't you live there once? You want Dad to be able to say, yes, let me tell you about when we lived there, Mom and I. Let me tell you when I built that house, the first house I ever designed and built. Let me tell you what it meant to move from St. Louis to here. Let me tell you what winter really was. Let me tell you what it was like living as a Jew in that community in Northern California or Nevada or anywhere in this country. Let me tell you what it meant to be me so that you understand what it means to be you. But what we need there is shared memory to create that kind of future. Today in our liturgy, as I mentioned, it's called Yom HaZikaron, a day dedicated to memory. Next week, we'll light yizkor candles, remembrance candles. So take opportunities then to gather people around you and talk about the people for whom you light those flames. Don't just tell them who they were. Tell them how they lived. Tell them something of their values and their struggles and their story. Because by telling them their struggles and their story, the little and large people around us realize, oh, I'm going to struggle. And at that moment, I can draw on that memory of what our people do in those occasions. Does it matter in the Do You Know test where your mother went to school? No, it doesn't matter which school. But what matters is, did she go through what I'm going through in the 10th grade on this Thursday morning of my life? That matters. We need the strength and resilience that we give one another. We are like fabric sewn to one another, like a talit that has these tattered edges on the end, but ultimately relies on all the fabric being pulled together. And we are the ones who have to not wait for gravity or God or someone else to pull those strands together. We have to do it ourselves. That's the responsibility of being teachers. And all parents are teachers. The word Torah means teacher. The word Morah means teacher. The word horim, parents, means teachers. They're all related. All of those words teach us what it means to be inspired and to inspire and to teach and to learn from one another and to know that we're never off. Any given day that we have breath and life, we have the gift of teaching through our stories and through our examples. We say to God this morning and last night and again next week, Zochreinu lechaim. God, remember us. And God says, but you don't remember you. You just remember yesterday. And you're so bent on thinking about tomorrow that I can't get you even here. You're in the synagogue, but thinking about what you haven't done, what you're yet to do, what might happen, the worries that haven't yet materialized. And God says, but for a moment, you're asking me to be mindful of you. Be mindful of me. And remember you. Remember your story. I want to tell you one last thing. I think it's such a beautiful image from our Torah. When the high priests were carrying the Ark of the Covenant with the Torah, with the broken tablets and the whole tablets in it, there's a gorgeous image. They were carrying it, but they had to face the opposite direction. Now think about that. They had to walk forward while facing backwards. And ask yourself if that isn't a memory for this entire conversation and for this holy day. They had to carry something precious and vital to the future, but all the while keeping their eyes on the story that was, on the journey that they made. That's a gift. Ask yourself as you go forward how important it is to stop and look back. And let your memories not ever be burdens, be teachers and be gifts and be sources of our inspiration. Leshana Tova, a happy, healthy new year. Let's make extraordinary and rich memories in the year to come.